Good afternoon. My name is Todd Presner. I'm a professor of Germanic languages and Jewish studies at UCLA and the former director of UCLA's Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's Ross Lecture in Yiddish Studies. We have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Alyssa Quint, who will be giving a lecture today on her recent work dealing with the Yiddish stage and Yiddish theater, and introduced by my colleague from UC San Diego, Professor Amelia Glazer. I would say that Amelia and I, if I may, have known each other for almost 2 decades, and in fact have intersected numerous times, not only because we're both in the UC system, but we also completed PhDs together just a couple years apart at Stanford. It's so wonderful to get a chance to reconnect with her and also to see so many of her amazing recent publications, of which I'll just mention a couple. She's a professor of Russian and comparative literature at UC San Diego, directs the program in Jewish studies and Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies. And among her many books, and there really are many, I'll mention Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, which came out of Northwestern in 2012, an editor of Stories of Kalmytsky, Competing Literary Legacies of a Ukrainian Cossack Uprising, which came out with Stanford in 2015, and then 2 books that both came out in 2020, Comintern Aesthetics, which is out of University of Toronto, and this is nearly 600-page book dealing with the multiplicity of artistic and visual forms from the 1920s, 30s, Soviet Union, mostly geared towards art in terms of thinking about possibilities for human liberation, and both encountering both the successes and failures of what that visual aesthetic was about. But I'm most excited to say that her book out of Harvard, which just came out a couple months ago, called Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle from Scottsboro to Palestine, is really such an urgent and timely, and I think really kind of does such a service to the field by connecting songs and poetry of Jewish leftist poets dealing with collective trauma and oppression, and bringing that poetry in terms of issues around global solidarity. So it's Yiddish poetry about Palestinian Arabs, about African Americans, about Spanish Republicans, and what it is that Yiddish can do in creating these bonds of ethics and solidarity between peoples that are oppressed. I'm really excited about this book, and I'm also really excited that Amelia is here to dialogue with Alyssa. And without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to my colleague, Professor Glazer.
Thank you so much, Todd. Thank you for those nice words and for including me in this event. I'm really excited to be talking with Professor Alyssa Quint about her book, which is fantastic. It's an outstanding study of the rise of Yiddish theater, and in particular of Goldfaden's theater. So I'll go ahead and introduce Alyssa, and then we'll let her take over and talk about the book a bit before our conversation. Alyssa Quint is the Leon Charney Visiting Fellow at Yeshiva University, and she's also an editor of the history section at Tablet magazine. The Rise of the Modern Yiddish Theater was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Alyssa has also co-edited 2 forthcoming volumes on the Yiddish theater. One is an edited work of essays and translations called Women on the Yiddish Stage, and a critical edition of a legendary Yiddish operetta called Shulamis, which she discusses in The Rise of Yiddish Theater as well. She has written articles, she's given lectures, she's also curated a new exhibit called A Tale of Two Museums, which can be found online at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, and she's also written for Tablet magazine, of course. So it's been really a pleasure to get to read this book closely. It's a book full of stories about Goldfandin himself, which was a great theater director at the end of the 19th century, but also about how this art form took shape in a very modern way over 100 years ago. It's been a pleasure to get to engage closely with Alyssa also over the past year, and Zoom has facilitated that to some degree. Earlier this fall, we were on a panel together at the Yiddish Book Center discussing Yiddish responses to the Scottsboro trial in the American South. Alyssa has also generously shared comments on my work with me, and they've always been incredibly astute. So she's a wonderful colleague as well as a really fantastic writer. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you about the book.
Thanks so much, Amelia. That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you. Thanks to the UCLA Levy Center for the invitation, and thanks to you, Todd, for being here with us, and thanks to Amelia, whose scholarship I greatly admire. It's an honor. It's a real honor to be here. My book began as a literary biography of Avrom Goldfaden. Avrom Goldfaden was a Russian Jewish intellectual who composed Yiddish and Hebrew songs and poetry, and eventually became a librettist and a composer of Yiddish operettas. And he is considered by historians, by history, to be the father of the modern Yiddish theater. So Goldfaden's operettas would come to constitute the canon of the Yiddish theater during the entire duration of the theater's roughly 100 years of existence. So I'm saying 1876 to 1976, approximately. There's still some Yiddish theater that persists today. Goldfandin is treated by historians of literature and drama rather apologetically. They suggest his work is middling at best and sometimes rather offensive, because of his portrayals of Jews that slide into stereotype. And they say that his work is not as sophisticated as the Yiddish literature of the same period of time. So on the other hand, they say these shortcomings are compensated by the fact that he created the modern Yiddish theater. And that's the framework that Yiddish scholarship used to explain how the theater came about. So Jacob Schatzky, who's an important historian of Jewish history during the interwar period, all of these histories or narratives come together, and they actually tell a pretty coherent story about Goldfaden. He says that Goldfand was faced with this very daunting task of staging Yiddish theater for the masses, and the masses had no experience with theater. So how good could it have been with this challenge before him? And Soviet historians and critics agree that Goldfaden's importance laid in his ability to be a modern vehicle of expression for the primitive shtetl-born performance forms of the wedding jester and the Purim spieler. And they point to the fact that his first actors were such entertainers, such shtetl entertainers. Given such cultural conditions, how much more could they have accomplished, they argue. So the deep folk roots and orientation to the masses made the Yiddish theater appealing to the Soviets, eager at that time to support and promote minority cultures that had been repressed by the Tsar. And at the heart of this narrative was the idea that the theater was born in a small tavern in Yosi, Romania. So primitive audience, staged by untrained primitive actors and born in a tavern in Yosi, Romania, and as a tool to enlighten the masses along the precepts of the Enlightenment. So what struck me as strange about this historical treatment of Yiddish theater, and most of this scholarship, like I said, was done during the interwar period. What struck me as strange was how little it said about Goldfandin in Russia. So why is this strange? Consider the timeline. We're now just talking about a 7-year period, and that's really the deep dive that my book does. It just really goes into those 7 formative years from 1876 to 1883. Goldfand puts on some theatrical shows in Yosi, Romania, but by 1878, Goldfand and his troupe return to the Russian Empire. So there are 2 years in Romania and then 5 years in the Russian Empire, back in the city, his beloved city of Odessa. In 1878, Goldfandin negotiates with the powers that be in St. Petersburg, and the result is really astonishing. Yiddish theater is permitted in the empire for those years, and not just in the Pale of Settlement, but throughout the empire. In 1883, the Tsar shutters the Yiddish theater, so that's when things come to an end. But between 78 and 83, Goldfandin's accomplishments as an impresario, director, and composer are infinitely greater. He plays Odessa's largest venue, the Mariinsky Theater. He plays St. Petersburg and Moscow, cities that are still restricted to Jews and beyond the Pale. So I was really flummoxed as to why Russian historians were more eager to tell the story of Yosi and far less eager to unfurl this period during which I would assume there would be a natural progression in Goldfandin's work, and there would be some indications that the theater, there were some indications already that theater enjoyed great prestige. And while I was researching this book, a Russian scholar by the name of Yevgeny Ginievich published a really modest-looking 20-page bibliography of every mention he could track down of the Yiddish theater in the Russian press. And this included little otherwise forgettable local newspapers of small cities. Of course, Odessa, Nikolaev, Kiev, Kishinev, Kharkiv. For this small window of 1878 to 1883, Yiddish theater performances generated over 1,000 notices or reviews, mostly in the non-Jewish press. There is no Yiddish press during this time. So when I read the notices and reviews and read them alongside reams of memoirs, a very different picture of this first chapter of the Yiddish theater emerges. Goldfand was not interested in enlightening the masses. He was really interested in staging theater in the venues that he and his intellectuals were already going to. He sought out the middle class. He was after money. He wanted to make money. And I shift away. So I shift away from this narrative pretty dramatically in my book, the narrative of those interwar historians. And what I found was that the Yiddish theater was really a part of what opera historians call the urbanization of opera. It was of a piece with 19th century urban-based Russian performing arts. And no one knew this scene better than Goldfand because he was an avid visitor to the theater. He and his pals would go, every night when they could. They were real insatiable consumers of it, and Jews were disproportionately that consumers of the theater. Of course, this is before Yiddish theater. In most cities, if not just in Russia, but across Europe. So how did Yiddish theater elbow its way into the most important opera houses in the province's cities? Well, audiences were used to taking in opera in different languages. So Italian opera because of Italian cultural primacy, and German theater for the sizable and influential German ethnic population that lived in the empire, and French opera comes up in the 1860s and challenges the dominance of Italian opera. And all of this is in the Russian opera houses, much more than Russian opera. So most Russians were basically consumers of this type of opera in different languages. And so when Yiddish came along, they really didn't bat an eyelash. So did non-Jews really fill seats to see the likes of an operetta called Schmendrick or Die Zwei Kuni Lemlech, the Two Kuni Lemmels? There's kind of ridiculous sounding titles. Well, if Goldfandin had the lease at Odessa's Mariinsky Theater, the city's largest venue, twice a week, and if you think about Odessa's population, was around 350,000 residents, with Jews representing only 7% of that. So you would extrapolate that, yes, non-Jews had to have filled those seats. But we know they did because of the newspaper reviews. Among non-Jews, some were horrified by the Yiddish theater, and some gave it some negative press, some pretty brutal reviews in Moscow, for instance. But some really loved it, and some saw themselves as slumming it. And we know that they had great success commercially from memoirs of Yiddish actors and impresarios. So those seats were filled every night. And again, just to think about those non-Jewish consumers, the ethnic element of Goldfaden's theatrical productions really played to the expectation of Russian consumers because they were used to seeing Jews depicted on the stage. Scholars have portrayed Yiddish as the province of embarrassed writers who used Yiddish as a tool of enlightenment. And they also portray the Yiddish actors as jesters and entertainers, or rough-hewn entertainers. But this does not fit what plays out with the Yiddish theater, especially in Russia. Other impresarios join the fray. And I'll just give you a few names. The Yiddish novelist Nachum Sheikovitz translates Gogol's The Inspector in Yiddish during this period. Joseph Lerner, the journalist, mounts a whole bunch of Yiddish plays, including his version of La Juive. The writer Moses Lilienblum writes a script for the stage, and so does Abramovich Mendele. Lilienblum's play was actually staged, but it didn't survive. And another milestone is that the first female playwright, a woman named Maria Lerner, witnessed her play, The Chained Widow, Die Agune, on the boards during this period. The Yiddish theater also attracted actors from a diversity of backgrounds, including many refined and educated Jews. So those who lacked resources quickly remade themselves both on the stage and off the stage in their image. And at its height, and I'm just going to say a few more words just to give you some background. At its height, between 1878 and 1883, there were 8 Yiddish troops, 2 of them Goldfadens that were active in the empire. All of them, this is an important part of the story, all of them were among a tiny number of privately funded theaters trying to compete with the majority of troops in the empire that were heavily subsidized by the Imperial Theater's Directorate. So they're competing with those German and French and Italian troops coming into the empire and are subsidized by the government. Of course, the Yiddish theater and some other Russian theaters and other troops were not subsidized, and they were trying to go it on their own. And so this is why, when announcing the productions, I would keep on seeing in the Russian press entrepreneurial troops, because they were self-made. Soviet historians probably didn't like to use those words. Maybe it had a capitalist air to them, and so they avoided that, and maybe avoided pointing at these sources. I'm not sure. But for their added financial and legal obstacles, many of these troops did not last long, and the survivors really had to think along commercial lines. They staged reliably popular material and found venues in cities with sizable populations of Jewish merchants. So they were not looking for the masses. Odessa became the Yiddish theater's resident city, but cities with smaller Jewish populations also with opera houses were an attraction. And the way they actually funded or funded their theaters, their troops, was really by borrowing money from grain merchants. I like to say that instead of going to a bank and writing out, getting someone to write out a check, they had to bring these leather satchels into offices and just fill it up with cash and take it out. There's a couple of stories like this in the memoirs that are fun to read. And so the upshot, between 1878 and 1883, when the Yiddish theater decisively coalesces as an institution, it did so as a commercial endeavor, not as a folksy instrument of education. It served seasoned theater-going populations in urban centers. and not benighted Jewish shtetl dwellers. And it drew substantial numbers of non-Jews and played venues that served the general population. While there were payas and streimels on the stage, there were bow ties and jaunty walking sticks in the velvet upholstered loges. Maybe kind of a tragic note on that score is that in 1883, the Yiddish theater is shuttered by the government. And it's the same year that the monopoly of the Imperial Theater's Directorate is permanently dismantled, and private and commercial theater companies begin to enjoy unprecedented freedom. So this happens in 1883. So Russian actors celebrate, and Yiddish actors are packing their bag to leave the empire soon after that. So I'm going to leave it there so we can start chatting.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for writing this book. One of the things that I really love about it is the way that Goldfandin himself as a figure, as a kind of enigmatic figure, comes out. You know, this isn't a hagiography. You're not trying to tell us that he was this, God's gift. But you're depicting a larger than life figure who was doing his best to portray himself in a very particular way while he was portraying all of these stories on stage. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about Goldfandin and who he was and who he was trying to be. And maybe the disjuncture between those two things.
So Goldfandin is really, he's really a product of the Reform age of Alexander II's reforms. He goes to he's born to very modest circumstances, to a father who is a clockmaker and very pious. And he goes to a Russian Jewish school where government subsidized Russian Jewish school where he learns Russian and also Jewish subjects. And he's such an outstanding student that he is invited to go to the Russian Jewish seminary after that. And there he is as a stipendiary student. So there are other students there who are from the cities, Jewish students. He sleeps there. It's, I think, 7 years that he's there. And I think this is where he really refashions himself into someone that, a kind of nobility, a Jewish nobility, I guess, is how I look at Goldfandin, or how he tried to remake himself, partly in the image of these peers of his from the city that he found so fascinating, their manner, the way they dressed. And after that period of time, he goes to Odessa. He's actually, because he's a stipendiary student, he's actually supposed to go on assignment to be a teacher at a school. And it's really not for him. He really needs to be in Odessa. And he decides to just kind of leave his post and go to Odessa, and there he is with many of his colleagues, and he's in the theater every night and enjoying himself and writing and composing, and it's really, even before he starts his first stagings, first performances, he's already someone who with somewhat of a reputation as a poet, and who tries to, in his manner, make sure that people really know that. You can hear the sirens, New York City sirens behind me. Sorry. He's invited to Yosi as someone who can lecture to a group of men there who have been following his writings and his poetry. And he goes, and I know, Amelia, that you were interested in this performance that he does in Yosi, Romania, in a tavern. I think we spoke about it. You were charmed by the fact that he tells us so much about what he wore that evening. Really, many
Well, it just strikes me. Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot in cultural studies about the performance of identity, right? This is something we've been talking about since Judith Butler wrote about it. But this is very much it's an interesting lens to use to go back and look at a figure like Goldfaden, who's very obviously putting on performances on the stage in Yosi, and then also thinking about he's staging himself, he's costuming himself. He writes about his own costume design later and how he planned it.
Yes, very much so. And he also was very well versed in the rules of Russian declamation. So when he went to that tavern that evening, he was dressed really impeccably, and he couldn't have been more happy about his failure to engage the audience at the tavern, because it showed just how much better he was than his audience, because they couldn't relate to his declamation, and they couldn't relate to someone with a bow tie and the way he was dressed. And that's what he really underscores in his memoir when he's describing that moment. But luckily, Yisrael Grodner, who's an actor and a very seasoned entertainer, jumps onto the stage, and with the same materials, also by Goldfaden, he's able to entertain the scene. And of course, he takes great amount of pride in the fact that he was not able to entertain the crowd, that the crowd hated him and wanted him off the stage.
Amazing. I wonder if this might be a nice segue to talk about the shift in thinking about theater as originating in Odessa. Of course, he has these performances in Yosi, and he makes this conscientious choice to occupy the theater scene in Odessa. And part of what I'm wondering is how historically that decision was obvious. But part of what I'm also wondering is how Goldfaden might have given Odessa part of its color. Odessa's always been a multi-ethnic city. It was a multi-ethnic city for 100 years before he showed up. And certainly the performance of Jewish plays in the Central Theater of Odessa would have been accepted there in a way that it might not have been in other cities. But I'm wondering whether you see Goldfaden as also affecting the city in its self-conceptualization.
I love that question. Well, first, just to address the Yosi versus Odessa idea. So everyone insists on, all the historians insist on Yosi as the birthplace of the Yiddish theater. In fact, Romania issued a stamp in Goldfaden's memory in 2009, just to memorialize Yosi as the birthplace of the Yiddish theater. But what really happened is something more complicated than that. So he and Grodner start staging Yiddish performance. They start recruiting actors. They even integrate the theater in that they recruit their first woman's actor, Sophie Karp, and they start putting on, let's say, 2-act shows. And they're successful enough, but they really don't get beyond this kind of tavern venue. And Goldfand is not that interested in such a venue. He says to himself, this is not me. This is not where I would like to be. And he's not able to scale up with how much money they're able to make from those types of performances. So he throws in the towel. And then what happens is the Russo-Turkish War starts in 1877. Without getting into too many details about it, it really involves Russia. And Russia comes to fight alongside Romania against the Ottoman Empire. And what this means really is that tens of thousands of Russians are moving into Romania, soldiers and also contractors. And a lot of these contractors were from Odessa, and many of them actually Goldfaden knew from Odessa, knew personally. They had contracts, and he actually approached Russia to get a contract of his own. He had been done. He washed his hands of Yiddish theater, and he could not get a contract. So he goes back to theater, and he starts spreading the word among his colleagues and says, I'm putting these shows on if you want to come. And they're very, very enthusiastic. They're a great audience. And at that point, so what my point is, Yosi is really not Yosi even at that point. It's really almost like a mini Odessa during those couple of years. And so when the war ends, he knows he can follow his audience back to the Russian Empire, back to Odessa. And so it really isn't Yosi exactly that's the birthplace. It's much more a Russian version of it. And in terms of his effect on Odessa, this was a very difficult thing for me to glean from sources. And I was looking for that. I wanted to know the answer of the question, how much of an impression did Goldfandin make on the city? For a moment, he really does make a deep impression, according to memoirs. People who were attentive to theater during those couple of years and recorded it. So there's these but it's all very anecdotal, the impression. So there's a daughter of a conductor who gave an interview to one of the Soviet historians, and she said, my father would talk about Goldfandin at those shows. The shows were sold out, and you couldn't get a ticket even from agents. Agents were buying from agents, And, but on the other hand, I think that one of the reasons why it's hard to glean information is because Jews, the Jewish, especially the Jewish audience that Goldfandin captured during those years, they were going to the theater anyway. So they were already in the theater. The Yiddish theater comes, they're super enthusiastic about it. And then when the Yiddish theater leaves, they go to the Italian theater and they go to the French theater. And the actors are it's the real reason why there's institutional continuity. And he was actually able to found the theater is because of those actors who packed their bags and left. But the audience itself was a very fickle one. And it went back to other exciting content in the theaters.
It makes me think a little bit about, Yiddish Fiddler, which came out a few years ago in New York, and everybody saw it. People that didn't speak Yiddish saw Yiddish Fiddler. People who were not Jewish saw Yiddish Fiddler. I didn't get to see it because I'm in California, but I really, really wanted to, and of course I would have if I were there. It didn't really matter that it was in Yiddish because it was, it was a spectacle. It was an event. Everybody wanted to go to it, and the fact that this was a performance of Yiddish in the 19th century in a very Russified city, a city that had these sophisticated pretensions that everybody was going to. It does make me wonder whether dots might be connected between that moment and the, a kind of presence and acceptability of Yiddish as part of Odessa's identity. I realize that may be too much of a leap, too much of a hypothesis, but it does feel like that brief period of time when Goldfandin was everything may not have been completely lost.
Mm-hmm. I really like what you're saying, and it really resonates with Yiddish theater in general, because to the extent that any bit of Yiddish culture can really cross over and make a larger impression on a society or in a community, and have a kind of crossover success in Yiddish theater. It's theater that does it throughout history. And it's an irony that I think that a lot of these historians were writing during the interwar period from the Soviet Union and Poland, where a lot of the people who were attending Yiddish theater were not Yiddish speakers anymore. They were wanting to see what avant-garde thing was happening on the theater, on the stage, and it was often Yiddish that was doing that avant-garde thing, and so they had to see a Yiddish theater show, just like Fiddler on the Roof somehow managed to captivate New York audiences, Jewish and otherwise, with not as much of an avant-garde thing, but somehow, but its own, again, its own product that was done very, very well.
This is, I think, a good segue to another question that I had while I was reading this, because I've thought a lot about Russian and Ukrainian literature and performance, and the Jew is a role, it's a type in Slavic nativity performances, especially. This is the Russian balagan or Petrushka performance, and then the Ukrainian vertep, which is a kind of puppet nativity performance. And so nobody gets to have expressions. Everybody's just a stock character. You have the Jew, you have the Ivan, you have the devils, you have the angels. But this is something that shows up in literature as well. And the fact that now Goldfandin too kind of has that within a Jewish world is really fascinating to me. And I think in particular about the Kishuvmacherin that you write about, the sorceress, where you have this, this very comically old world Jewish figure, and then a much more modern Jewish figure that are foils for one another. And I'm curious whether you could talk a little bit about those roles, those different Jewish types that are also being performed and written as possibilities.
So I think that I think that the very Jewish types, like Hotzmach, the entertainer, and haberdasher, he's a peddler with a beard and payas, side locks. And then there are many characters like that throughout Goldfand's creative universe. There's a Shmendrik, who's covered with amulets, and he has also side locks. He's very religious. His mother's always very nervous about him. She's like, by some indirect lineage, maybe you can trace some sort of lineage from her to Woody Allen's castrating Zionist mother. So they have this kind of enduring quality to them. Some of these characters, some of the Jewish audiences just loved them and ate them up, and some others were really offended by them. I think that most non-Jewish audiences love them, I would say mostly for the right reason. I think some of them enjoyed the fact that they were so close, so resembled some anti-Semitic characters and caricatures. It's hard to know exactly. Again, some non-Jews were slumming it when they were going to the Yiddish theater. But I think while they were so entertained by the Hotzmach and the Kuni Lemel and the Shmendrik, I think that people like these actors, the people who were just coming to the theater for the first time, were really looking at Marcus and looking at all the more modern Jewish characters who were on the stage and trying to model themselves after him. They understood that it was Marcus who they needed to be, and not Kuni Lemel, although Goldfand wasn't as rough on Kuni Lemel and Shmendrik and Hotzmach as he might have been.
So that leads me to a follow-up question, because I wonder if you, and throughout this, I think that if there's an elephant in the room, if there's a specter haunting this moment, it's the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, and to what extent is the Shmendrik and the Kuni Lemel and the Hotzmach, to what extent are those figures the Jew that Don Miron identifies in works by Mendele? Right? Is this about sort of us versus the Jew, and the Jew that the Moscow has to get away from, or is this something so totally post-Musculic, going in a different direction, that we shouldn't compare the two?
I think it was one of the reviews that I read by in an Odessa newspaper, but clearly written by a Jewish journalist, wrote Goldfaden should not be putting on his theater here. He should be going to Berdichev. He should be going to areas where there's a lot of Hasidic Jews so they could take this in. What is Goldfaden doing here? I mean, he might be trying to make money, which is terrible. So I think that Goldfaden wasn't exactly didn't have a real strong anti-Hasidic message in most of his plays. If you look at them, he really tempers that type of propagandistic quality. It's more, he's just working off these very funny types that just make everyone laugh so hard, and he just can't resist it. But the Hasidim are supposed to be accepted. Kuni Lemel gets married, just like Marcus gets married at the end. He gets to have his future just the way Marcus does. So it's tempered. He's working off those stereotypes, but it's tempered.
Alyssa, I wanted to sort of shift over to talking a bit about how you wrote this book, how you researched this book, wrote it, what sources you use. What is your process? Walk us through your archival research. What are the threads that you pulled? And then as a segue, I'd also love for you to say something about this really fantastic appendix that you include at the back of the book. You actually have a translation of one of the scripts, Shulamis, and also this this synopsis of plays and another source, I believe. So if
yes,
you talk a little bit about all of that.
So of course I worked off the really wonderful scholarship of the interwar period, which I reframe in my book, but obviously that was a very important piece. And then also the Russian newspapers that this Binievich bibliography led me to, and those reviews were really gold. I think the most fun I had was reading memoirs of actors. A lot of them were serialized in Yiddish newspapers. Goldfaden's was the worst and the least informative, and it was the most disappointing. And it really led me off track. But once you read Jacob Adler, that's a whole other story, because he talks about wanting to get. He talks about trying to get a meeting with Goldfaden. And Jacob Adler became this very legendary actor on the American Yiddish stage. But at the time when he was, how are we doing with time? Okay.
I think we have time for, I'm hoping, another question or two.
Okay, terrific. And Todd, jump in if you have any questions or comments.
Yeah, I actually do, just on this issue. Maybe just wonder, just to kind of just put the frame of Amelia's question just in a slightly different way. I was really intrigued about the contribution of your work to the historiography of Yiddish theater. And a lot of it, of course, the reframing that you mentioned is motivated by the fact that you've consulted with so many sources from the Russian press, from memoirs, from Goldfaden, as well as the actors. And in many ways, it's changing, the narrative. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about, one, why certain narratives had been so entrenched, and maybe it's from the scholarship in the interwar period that's kind of been solidified, but how your work is also doing historiographic work, right? You're kind of looking at the narratives that have already been told and also reshaping them in some very fundamental ways. So I guess I was just thinking of a meta question that your work is also doing.
Thank you. Actually, one of the big discussions I had when I was working on this and looking at the memoirs, because I felt on shaky ground as a historian, I really was trained as a literature student, and I was expected to write a literary biography and look at his plays, which I do look at. I do look at his plays, and I do find they have relevance to the historical record. Although I didn't want to argue the case for them as having more literary worth than they do. So incrementally, I think I contribute a little bit to that conversation. I became much more interested in seeing how the theater was relevant to the historical record. And the memoirs, I kept on returning to the memoirs, thinking this is really a glimpse, a lens onto a world that I never got to see as a graduate student. And why isn't this any more relevant? And when I was a graduate student, I would read like Mendele or Shalom Aleichem, and they would paint such rich pictures of shtetl and village life. And then you would see a picture of Shalom Aleichem. I mean, there was almost very little visual culture that we were exposed to as students, and then you would see a picture of Shalom Aleichem, and he was this very dandified cosmopolitan writer, often in a studio shot. And I would say, what an interesting discrepancy. He's really not writing about his own world. He's really writing about a different world. And this would recur. And what the memoirs did, because the actors were so self-conscious about their change, about their performance on and off the stage, they would constantly tell us about when they switched their jackets from long ones to short ones. And it was this major thing, like what's going to happen when I switch my jacket? The real strong line was beard. You're shaving your beard. I had such amazing excerpts of the actors shaving their beards. And because it was such a strange trauma for them. And really, so there's this intellectual record of the Haskalah, or of the Jewish encounter with modernity, that is mostly, Jews lost their faith in God. That's one way they were introduced to modernity. Another way is through the framework of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. Another way was through, political ideology, socialism or Zionism. But the actors didn't fit into any of those. They weren't interested. They weren't really reading a lot of books. They were really, their encounter with modernity was with performance. And I think actually it made me think, well, that probably has a lot to say with the encounter of modernity by a lot of Jews who also didn't read books. They might not have gotten onto a stage, but they were definitely doing the same type of offstage performance that these actors were doing. So I think that's where the book really speaks to maybe larger questions.
That's so great. I mean, my mind is going in so many different directions about the signaling that we do with our, with our fashion, with our performance, but also when is that self-conscious and when is it natural? When do we make a note of it in our journal or write to someone? I wanted to ask you to say a few more things about the ban on the Yiddish theater, which you referenced in your introduction. But this is, it comes, I believe, in 1883, you said, and that's just a couple of years after, right, or a year after the May laws. And some of which were sort of followed with mixed results. So there are all of these strictures on Jewish life everywhere in the Tsarist Empire, and now no more Yiddish theater. And you've one of your really important innovations is to correct something that John Clear had said, which is that, well, it wasn't really fully followed, and you actually show no. It was disastrous. We know that it was followed to some extent because of what ended up happening with Yiddish theater afterwards. So can you say a little bit about this moment and what that did to Goldfaden's theater and to the legacy of his theater?
Sure. So yes, the wonderful John Clear actually went into the archives and found episodes of performance after 1883. And yes, there were those performances. He's correct, but they really paled in comparison to what Yiddish theater was in the city. So often he found these episodes in shtetl, in smaller venues, and this is something that when I spoke to actors about this, they really understood why this really didn't mean all that much. Because when you have such a fragile thing as a theater, and you have to worry about so much about where you're going to perform and your venue and pay your actors, and you have all these like sets that you have to lug around, and your costumes, you have to invest a great deal of money in your costumes. In fact, some of the newspapers would say, and they have amazing historical costumes. They put a lot of money into those costumes. So with all that, to not know when you're going to be shut down and when you are, when you're going to be allowed, really just at the whim of the, local official, which is how Fishson, he looks at stuff that Avram Fishson did, and also the great Esther Rachel Kaminska does theater like this for a decade and a half. So we know there were a couple of little troupes who did it, but what happens is most of the actors read the writing on the wall, and they leave the empire and they go to London and New York City and do far better there. So it doesn't really change the fact that it was a disaster. And Goldfaden, unfortunately, Goldfaden really waits around and says, I'm going to be able to reverse this. And he takes the train up to St. Petersburg, and he tries to negotiate the permission back, and it never happens. And he goes to Warsaw. We spoke about this, Amelia. There was a little bit of Yiddish theater that he produced under the guise of German theater. That's often how sometimes they got away with it. And he found that immensely degrading. It sounds like fun and kind of scandalous, but actually to someone like Goldfand and to many of the actors, they found it utterly degrading after being on the stage in Odessa at the Mariinsky or other venues such like that, often with Italian actors applauding them and singing their praises from the loges. So Goldfand leaves, he goes to New York City, and he tries to make it in New York City, and it doesn't work out for him. His actors kind of shut him out because he was exploitative, and they didn't want to collaborate with him anymore. And he never really returns with any success to the theater after that moment.
Well, I know we're starting to run out of time. It's a tragic story that you're telling, at least at the end. Goldfaden is basically, he's the King Lear that's shut out by his children or whatever. He's the
Yes.
Tevye that's shut out by his daughters. I think it may be time for us to wrap up, but if you had any final words on how Goldfaden's story ends, that might be a place to leave it.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, well, just because I've been so exposed to the Yiddish theater, it feels to me like I can't end on a tragic note. But I would say that the one thing that I was trying to resist in writing this book was to fall into the trap of calling him the father of the modern Yiddish theater. But I have to concede that he was that. And his legacy is really quite amazing. I talk in one talk I give, and I talk about this in chapter 2, is that it was kind of an accident, the Yiddish theater, in the sense that Jews were going to the theater and really never expected to have a Yiddish theater. They never expected to have theater in their own vernacular. And there were many times when people would put on a show here or a show there, and it would never have momentum. And under Goldfaden's persistence and maybe his amazing self-regard for himself, and also, his somewhat abusive treatment of his actors and his very competitive nature, and of course his wonderful talent to write both music and libretti, he managed to create an institution such that when the ban came, it became a real global phenomenon. And we see its heights in the interwar period, where box office receipts in New York City really compete with those of Broadway. And we see avant-garde theater on the stages in Poland. So I think that that is very much directly traceable to Goldfaden's efforts.
That's really great. And thank you for helping us to also not just to really reappreciate so much around the rise of Yiddish theater, but really to kind of reframe it and, take it right up, to the present. So I really appreciate the talk. And thank you so much, Amelia. This has been such a fascinating dialogue, and I'm so glad that we were able to, the three of us, come together in these somewhat precipitous times and talk about Yiddish theater, and certainly encourage everyone to go out and get your book, Alyssa. So
it was an honor. This is really wonderful. I finished it last night, and I mean, even reading through the appendix was exciting, especially after. I mean, you'd set us up for that, but highly recommended.
Thank you guys so much. You've been a perfect audience, really. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and we'll certainly be excited to share this talk with the broader audience through the Levy Center. So I wish you both a very good day.
Thanks, Todd. You too.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you.